A map unfolds before us now, its edges softened by time. We find ourselves gazing upon the Arctic Ocean, that vast and silent realm where ice meets water beneath skis that forget the meaning of night. The date is May 1928, and a red circle marks coordinates that will soon become famous. 80 degrees north latitude, where an Italian airship named Italia will meet the frozen sea. This is a story of endurance, told slowly, meant for restful listening. We will speak of cold and waiting, of patience stretched across 7 weeks upon drifting ice. Some difficult moments arise in this history, though we shall describe them gently, with respect for those who lived them and those who did not return. Settle into comfort now. Let the ambient wind carry us northward, toward Svalbard, toward the expedition that awaits. We begin gently, with maps and quiet context, settling into the pace of polar time. The morning of May 23, 1928, arrived with pale light spreading across the snow-covered shores of Kings Bay. This remote Norwegian settlement on Svalbard's western coast had become, for a brief season, the launching point for polar ambition. Wooden buildings huddled near the waterline, their windows dark, their chimneys trailing thin smoke into the Arctic air. Beyond them, glaciers descended from mountains whose peaks had never known the warmth of summer. At the mooring mast, the airship Italia floated with patient grace. Her silver envelope caught the early light, transforming it into something luminous, a great whale of fabric and aluminum suspended above the snow. She measured over 300 feet in length, her gondola hanging beneath like a careful thought, and within that gondola, 16 men prepared for the journey ahead. General Umberto Nobile stood at the center of preparations. A small man with precise movements and a carefully trimmed mustache, he had designed this vessel and commanded its predecessor, the Norge, which had crossed the North Pole 2 years before. That earlier expedition had brought fame but also friction, disputes over credit with the legendary Roald Amundsen that still echoed in newspapers across Europe. Now Nobile sought to prove Italian achievement with an Italian crew aboard an Italian ship. The crew gathered in the cold, their breath forming small clouds that drifted away on the stillness. There was Giuseppe Biagai, the radio operator, whose fingers would soon tap out messages across impossible distances. Finn Malmgren, the Swedish meteorologist, studied the sky with the careful attention of one who reads weather as others read books. Natal Sessiony, the chief technician, checked instruments and valves with the patience of long experience. And there was Titina, Nobile's small terrier, who would share her master's fate upon the ice, a detail that seems almost tender now, knowing what came after. Mooring ropes creaked against their anchors. The envelope swayed gently, responding to breezes that carried the scent of salt and ice. Inside the gondola, maps had been spread across the navigation table, weighted at their corners against the drafts that found their way through every seam. The route northward had been marked in careful pencil, a line extending toward the geographic pole and beyond, where the expedition hoped to conduct scientific surveys of unmapped ice. The purpose was threefold. Italy sought national prestige in an era when polar exploration captured the world's imagination. Scientists aboard hoped to study magnetic variations, atmospheric conditions, and the behavior of ice in regions rarely observed. and Nobile himself carried the weight of personal vindication, a need to demonstrate that the Norga's success had been his achievement as much as anyone's. Frost clung to metal surfaces, requiring careful attention before departure. The envelope filled with hydrogen held the lifting power that would carry them north, but hydrogen brought its own concerns, flammable, sensitive to temperature, requiring constant monitoring. The crew had trained for emergencies, though none expected to need such training. Confidence filled the gondola as engines were tested and retested, their hum steady and reassuring. At 4:30 in the morning local time, the order came. Ground handlers released the mooring lines, and the Italia began to rise. The motion was gentle, almost imperceptible at first, a gradual separation from the earth that felt less like flight and more like floating in a dream. The snow-covered ground fell away, the wooden buildings shrank to toys, and the fjord opened beneath them in shades of gray and white. Those remaining on the ground watched the silver shape diminish against the sky. Some waved, others simply stood in the cold, witnesses to a departure whose meaning they could not yet know. The Italia turned northward, her nose pointing toward latitudes where compasses grew unreliable and the sun circled without setting. Inside, the crew settled into stations. The gondola measured roughly 60 feet in length, cramped quarters for 16 men and their equipment. Bunks lined one wall. Instruments occupied every available surface. Windows, small and thick, offered views of the ice fields now sliding past below, endless white interrupted only by pressure ridges and occasional dark leads of open water. The engines maintained their steady rhythm, 3 of them pushing the Italia forward at perhaps 50 miles per hour. It was not fast travel, but it was persistent, and persistence would carry them across the frozen sea. Nobile consulted his charts, made notes in the expedition log, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Everything proceeded as planned. Titina curled in a small space near the commander's station, accustomed to the vibrations and sounds of flight. She had flown aboard the Norga and seemed to regard airship travel as entirely natural. Her presence offered comfort to the crew, a living reminder that ordinary life continued even here, at the margins of the world. The coast of Svalbard receded behind them, replaced by open ice. They would not see land again for many hours, and when they next touched solid surface, nothing would be as expected. The airship rises slowly, and we rise with her, leaving the safety of solid ground for skis unknown. The hours unfolded in the patient rhythm of engine noise and wind. Above the Arctic Ocean, the Italia pressed northward through skis that held no darkness, only variations of gray and pale gold, as the sun circled near the horizon without setting. The men aboard fell into routines quickly established, each finding his place in the careful choreography of polar flight. Navigation required constant attention. Finn Malmgren consulted his instruments, noting wind speeds and directions, while the navigators tracked their position by dead reckoning and occasional sextant readings. This far north, magnetic compasses wandered unreliably, drawn by forces beneath the ice that confused their needles. The crew relied instead on sun observations when visibility allowed, and on careful calculation when clouds obscured the sky. The ice below stretched in all directions, a white plain broken by pressure ridges that cast long shadows in the perpetual low-angled light. Open leads of dark water appeared occasionally, snaking between ice floes like black rivers through a frozen desert. The Italia's shadow moved across this landscape, a dark oval sliding over white, marking their passage toward the pole. Inside the gondola, warmth came from the engine's proximity and from the bodies of 16 men occupying a small space. Yet drafts found their way through, and frost accumulated on surfaces nearest the windows. The men wore layers of wool and fur, their movements restricted by the cramped quarters. Condensation formed on the interior of windows, requiring periodic wiping to maintain visibility. Meals were simple affairs. Provisions included bread, cheese, chocolate, and canned goods, eaten at intervals that had little connection to the clock. Without the natural rhythm of day and night, time became abstract, measured in miles traveled, in fuel consumed, in the slow progress of their pencil line across the chart. Bayagai monitored the radio, maintaining contact with the base at Kings Bay and with ships positioned in supporting roles. Messages crackled through static, voices made distant and strange by the vast spaces between transmitter and receiver. Weather reports arrived intermittently, promising continuing calm conditions ahead. The crew received this news with quiet satisfaction, knowing that weather in these latitudes could change without warning. The 3 engines, mounted in external nacelles along the envelope, required attention from the flight engineers. Sessiony oversaw their operation, alert to any change in sound or vibration that might signal trouble. The engines burned a mixture of gasoline and benzol, their exhausts trailing behind the airship in thin streams that dispersed quickly in the cold air. The hum of these engines became the background music of the journey, so constant that its absence would have been alarming. Maps unfurled on the navigation table showed the curvature of their route, the gradual convergence of longitude lines as they approached the pole. At the top of the world, all directions become south. East and west lose meaning. The navigators understood this geometrically, but experiencing it remained strange, a reminder that ordinary assumptions about space did not apply in these latitudes. The crew spoke little during long stretches of flight. Conversation required effort in the engine noise, and besides, there was little to discuss that had not been discussed many times before. They watched the ice instead, noting its patterns, its colors, the way light fell across its surface at different hours. Some read from books brought for the journey, others dozed in their bunks, catching rest while conditions remained calm. Titina moved about the gondola, investigating corners, settling in warm spots, accepting attention from crew members who found comfort in her small presence. She seemed unbothered by the strangeness of their situation, suspended between ice and sky, traveling toward a point that existed only as an abstraction on charts. The Italia crossed degree after degree of latitude, each one bringing them closer to their goal. The ice below showed no variation that would mark their progress. Only the instruments confirmed their northward movement. They passed beyond 75 degrees, then 80, entering regions where few human eyes had ever looked. Malmgren studied the weather with growing attention. He noted subtle changes, shifts in cloud formation, variations in wind direction, that spoke to his trained eye of conditions ahead. The barometric pressure held steady for now, but the meteorologist understood how quickly Arctic weather could turn. He shared his observations with Nobile, who received them with the careful consideration of a commander weighing options. The gondola's interior had taken on the particular character of inhabited spaces, the smell of engine oil and wool, the arrangement of personal items in small corners, the patterns of movement that crew members developed to navigate around one another. It was a small world suspended in vastness, carrying its own warmth and human presence through the indifferent cold. As hours accumulated, the pole drew closer. The crew's anticipation grew quietly, manifest in glances toward the charts, in small adjustments to instruments, in the way attention sharpened despite fatigue. Hours pass in the rhythm of engines and wind, the world below a seamless white. On the morning of May 24th, the Italia reached the geographic North Pole. The moment arrived without drama. No visible marker distinguished this point from any other on the endless ice. Yet instruments confirmed their position, and the crew understood that they floated directly above the axis around which the Earth turned. Nobile ordered the engine slowed. The Italia descended through gentle altitude adjustments until she hovered at perhaps 500 feet above the ice. Below, the frozen surface spread in every direction, indifferent to the significance humans attached to this location. Pressure ridges cast shadows in patterns that revealed nothing of the pole's meaning. The ceremony was brief but weighted with intention. The crew gathered near windows, watching as objects were prepared for dropping to the ice below. An Italian flag descended first, its colors bright against the white, a claim of arrival, a marker that would soon be buried by drifting snow. A wooden cross followed, blessed before departure by the Pope himself, carrying religious significance for the Catholic crew members. Finally, a small banner bearing the insignia of the city of Milan fluttered downward, settling on the ice in a splash of color. Radio messages were composed and transmitted, announcing their achievement to the world. The words crackled outward through static, received at Kings Bay and relayed to Italian stations, where news spread to newspapers and radio broadcasts. Italy had reached the pole by air, and Nobile had accomplished what he set out to prove. The crew permitted themselves quiet celebration. There were handshakes, brief embraces, words of congratulation exchanged in the engine noise. Photographs were taken, men posing near windows, the ice visible below, faces showing satisfaction and fatigue in equal measure. These images would later circulate worldwide, documenting a triumph that would soon be shadowed by trial. Malmgren studied the weather during the hover, noting conditions with professional attention. The sky remained overcast but stable, the wind light, the temperature well below freezing but not extreme by Arctic standards. He reported no immediate concerns, though he emphasized the unpredictability of polar conditions. Weather could change within hours, he reminded Nobile, and they were far from any possibility of assistance. The original plan called for a brief observation at the pole before returning to Kings Bay. But Nobile, emboldened by success and favorable conditions, proposed extending the survey. There were regions north of the Soviet Union that remained unmapped from the air, territories where scientific observations would contribute valuable data. The extra fuel reserve seemed adequate, and the crew expressed willingness to continue. The decision was made to press onward, to extend the expedition's reach beyond its original scope. This choice would later be examined and criticized, but in the moment, it seemed reasonable, an expansion of achievement rather than a risk. The Italia turned away from the pole, her nose pointing toward the Siberian coast, where unexplored ice awaited observation. As they departed the pole's vicinity, ice crystals began forming on the envelope. The phenomenon was not unexpected, moisture in the air freezing upon contact with the cold fabric, but Malmgren watched with attention that would later seem prescient. Ice added weight, and weight affected flight. The balance was precise, the margins smaller than they appeared. The crew resumed their stations, the brief pause for ceremony giving way to continued operations. The engines returned to full power, pushing the Italia across latitudes that few expeditions had traversed. The ice below continued its endless variations of white and shadow, and the sun circled in its perpetual polar day. Nobile recorded the achievement in his log, noting the time, the position, the conditions. He permitted himself satisfaction but tempered it with awareness of the distance still to travel. Kings Bay lay hundreds of miles to the south, across ice and open water, through weather that could not be predicted. The triumph was real, but it was not the end. Wind shifted slightly as they flew, the first subtle indication of changing conditions. None aboard recognized the significance at the time. Such variations were common and usually harmless. The Italia continued onward, carrying her crew toward what awaited. They circled the pole twice, savoring a triumph that will soon give way to trial. The return journey began with conditions that seemed acceptable. The Italia turned southward, her engines pushing against headwinds that had shifted since the outbound flight. Malmgren monitored his instruments with the focused attention of one who understood Arctic weather's capacity for sudden change. The barometric pressure had begun to fall, a development he noted in his log with underlined concern. Ice continued to accumulate on the envelope. The fabric's outer surface, chilled by altitude and Arctic air, provided an ideal substrate for frozen moisture. Crystals built upon crystals, adding weight that the hydrogen within struggled to compensate. The Italia flew lower than intended, her altitude gradually diminishing as the ice burden grew. Visibility reduced as fog banks materialized in their path. The horizon, which had been clear during the polar observation, disappeared behind curtains of gray-white mist. Navigation became more challenging, relying increasingly on dead reckoning as sun observations became impossible. The crew's attention sharpened, the comfortable rhythm of the outbound journey giving way to vigilance. Inside the gondola, the atmosphere grew quieter. Conversation ceased as men focused on their instruments, their responsibilities, their awareness of changing conditions. The engine noise remained constant, but the human sounds, the small talk, the movements between stations, diminished into concentration. Malmgren consulted repeatedly with Nobile, sharing observations that painted an increasingly concerning picture. The airship handled differently now, responding sluggishly to control inputs. Sessiony reported that the engines were working harder to maintain speed, burning fuel at rates that exceeded the careful calculations made before departure. The margin of reserve, comfortable at the expedition's start, shrank as miles passed and conditions worsened. Fog thickened around them, reducing visibility to hundreds of feet at times. The ice below appeared and disappeared through breaks in the murk, glimpses of a world that seemed to be receding from their reach. The crew could no longer observe the surface for navigation purposes. They flew by instruments alone, trusting calculations that accumulated small errors over distance. The cold intensified, or perhaps simply became more noticeable as the situation grew serious. Frost coated every surface inside the gondola that approached the exterior walls. Windows required constant attention to maintain even partial visibility. Breath froze on mustaches and collars, forming small accumulations of ice that crew members brushed away absently. Nobile faced decisions that polar commanders have always faced, whether to push forward, whether to turn back, whether to seek altitude or descend. Each choice carried risks that could not be fully assessed with available information. He consulted with his officers, weighed the factors, and chose to continue toward Kings Bay. The distance behind them exceeded the distance ahead. Return seemed the logical course. The Italia descended further as ice weight increased. She flew now at perhaps 1,000 feet, lower than safe practice recommended, yet unable to climb without shedding weight that could not be shed. The crew considered options, releasing equipment, jettisoning supplies, but such measures seemed premature. Conditions might improve, the fog might lift, the ice accumulation might stabilize. Hours passed in this suspended uncertainty. The engines droned on, their rhythm unchanged despite the changing circumstances. The fog parted occasionally, offering glimpses of ice that looked the same in every direction, white, ridged, uninhabited, offering no landmarks by which to confirm their position. The navigators worked their calculations, estimating location based on time, speed, and heading, aware that errors compounded with each passing hour. Malmgren's concern deepened. The weather patterns he observed suggested further deterioration ahead. The pressure continued falling. The winds continued shifting. The fog showed no signs of lifting. He shared this assessment with Nobile, who received it with the stillness of a man weighing options that held no good choices. The crew maintained their stations, performing duties with the automatic precision of trained professionals. Yet beneath the routine, awareness spread of their situation's seriousness. They were far from assistance, flying an aircraft burdened by ice, navigating through conditions that obscured any reference points. The margins had narrowed, the reserves had diminished, the path ahead held only uncertainty. As the hours accumulated, fatigue joined the other challenges. The crew had been operating for extended periods, sleep scarce in the cramped quarters, attention demanded by circumstances that permitted no relaxation. Yet they continued, because continuing was what remained to be done. Ice gathers slowly upon the airship's skin, adding weight that cannot be shed. The morning of May 25th arrived without visible dawn, the sun hidden behind fog that had closed around the Italia like a gray curtain. The airship flew low now, burdened by ice, her altitude measured in hundreds of feet rather than thousands. The ice-covered ocean passed below in glimpses between fog banks, close enough that crew members could distinguish individual pressure ridges. Malmgren had been awake through the night, watching instruments that told an increasingly urgent story. The barometric pressure continued its fall. The winds had shifted unfavorably. The accumulating ice exceeded any safe threshold. He conveyed his concerns to Nobile with the careful precision of a scientist stating facts rather than offering opinions. The facts were concerning enough. The gondola tilted unexpectedly, a motion that sent unsecured objects sliding across surfaces. The crew grabbed handholds, steadied themselves, exchanged glances that communicated without words. Something had changed in the airship's behavior, a heaviness, a reluctance to respond to controls that had functioned normally hours before. Nobile ordered adjustments, attempts to regain altitude, efforts to redistribute weight. The engineers responded with practiced efficiency, but the Italia continued her gradual descent. The gap between airship and ice surface narrowed from hundreds of feet to dozens, the frozen ocean rising toward them with patient inevitability. The impact, when it came, arrived with less violence than might be expected. The control gondola struck the ice at an angle, dragging across the surface with sounds of tearing metal and rending fabric. The shock threw men from their positions, tumbled equipment across the interior, mixed the orderly arrangements of flight into chaos. And then, in a moment that would define the expedition's tragedy, the envelope tore free. The great silver bag, still holding hydrogen, still possessing lift, separated from the gondola and rose back into the fog. 9 men remained inside or clinging to its structure, swept upward, carried away, vanishing into the gray murk within seconds. They were never seen again. The gondola came to rest upon the ice, its structure crumpled, its contents scattered across the frozen surface. 10 men lay upon the white plain, thrown clear during the impact, injured in various degrees, alive but stranded in circumstances that permitted no immediate comprehension of their situation. Silence followed the crash with the weight of held breath. The engine noise that had accompanied them for days ceased absolutely. The fog hung motionless around them. The ice creaked with small sounds that seemed enormous in the stillness. Men groaned, shifted, began the slow process of assessing damage to themselves and their surroundings. Nobile lay among the wreckage, unable to rise. His right arm and right leg had sustained fractures during the impact, injuries that would prevent him from walking throughout the ordeal ahead. Pain clouded his initial awareness, but through it came the commander's reflex, the need to account for his crew, to understand what had happened, to begin formulating response. Sessiony had also broken his leg, the bone displaced in a manner that would require careful attention. Others bore lesser injuries, bruises, cuts, strains, but had retained the ability to move. They gathered slowly, helping one another, beginning to inventory what remained of their expedition. The scattered wreckage told its story across the ice. Equipment had been flung in patterns that mapped the crash's violence. Food containers lay among instrument cases, clothing mixed with navigation tools. The radio set, miraculously, had survived relatively intact, thrown clear of the worst damage. Its survival would prove essential in the days ahead. The men who remained began counting those present, confirming identities, arriving at the number that would define their survival effort. 10 had come to rest upon the ice. 9 had vanished with the envelope. The mathematics were simple. The meaning was profound. Among those lost were several who had been central to the expedition's operations: engineers, scientists, crew members whose absence would be felt immediately and continuously. The fog showed no sign of lifting. The ice stretched in all directions without visible landmark or feature that might indicate their location. They possessed only partial supplies, what had happened to fall near them during the crash. The radio offered hope, but hope required function, and function required assessment, repair, and power that might or might not be available. For long minutes, no one spoke beyond the necessary exchanges of immediate assistance. The scale of what had occurred was too large for immediate processing. They were castaways on drifting ice, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, injured, inadequately supplied, and separated from half their company by a tear in fabric that had taken only seconds to complete. The wind picked up slightly, sending fine crystals of snow across the crash site. The men pulled their clothing tighter, began the movements that would become routine over weeks to come. The constant battle against cold, the ceaseless effort to maintain warmth in conditions that sought to drain it from their bodies. Nobile, from where he lay, began issuing orders. His voice, though weakened by pain, carried the authority of command. There was work to be done if they were to survive. The time for shock would come later, or perhaps not at all. What mattered now was action. In moments, what was airborne becomes earthbound, and silence follows the crash like a held breath. The hours following the crash unfolded in the suspended time of emergency. The 10 survivors, Nobile, Bayagai, Trojani, Bihaunek, Viglieri, Mariano, Zappi, Malmgren, Sessioni, and one other, began the essential work of survival with movements slowed by cold and shock. The fog persisted around them, limiting visibility to the immediate crash site, enclosing them in a gray world without horizon. First came assessment. Those able to walk moved among the injured, evaluating conditions with what medical knowledge the crew possessed. Nobile's fractures required immobilization. Splints were improvised from wreckage materials. Sessioni's leg demanded similar attention, though movement would remain impossible for him without assistance. The others bore wounds that permitted function, and function was desperately needed. The scattered supplies presented a grim inventory. Food had survived in portions: pemmican, chocolate, condensed milk, biscuits, enough for sustenance but not abundance. The amounts would require careful rationing from the start. Water posed no problem. The ice surrounding them could be melted, though the process required heat that was itself a scarce resource. The radio had landed with its essential components intact, a stroke of fortune that would shape everything to follow. Bayagai examined it with the attention of one whose professional purpose now carried the weight of all their lives. Vacuum tubes had survived. The transmitter appeared functional. The question became power, and power required batteries or a hand-cranked generator that had also made it through the crash. Shelter became the immediate priority. Among the salvaged materials was fabric, red-dyed silk that had served various purposes aboard the Italia. This fabric, stretched across bamboo poles that had been part of the airship's structure, could form a tent. The work proceeded slowly, injured men directing those who could move, collective effort producing a structure that measured roughly 8 feet by 12 feet. The red tent. It would become the expedition's symbol, a small bright mark upon the endless white where rescue aircraft might spot them. The color had been chosen for visibility, though at the time of construction, rescue seemed an abstract possibility rather than an immediate hope. The men worked because work kept cold at bay, because purpose preserved sanity, because shelter was necessary and therefore must be built. Inside the completed tent, the survivors arranged themselves as comfortably as space permitted. Nobile and Sessione, unable to move independently, were placed where their injuries could receive attention. The others fitted themselves around them, bodies closed together, sharing warmth that no fire could provide. They had salvaged sleeping bags and blankets, materials that would prove essential as temperatures dropped. The ice beneath them groaned with sounds that would become familiar, creaks and cracks that signaled the frozen surface's constant motion. Their flow drifted upon Arctic currents, moving imperceptibly but continuously, carrying them in directions they could not control. Navigation calculations would later reveal this drift, a southward motion that both helped and hindered their situation. A small stove had survived, along with fuel sufficient for limited use. Melting ice for water became the first priority, preparing warm drinks, a luxury that maintained morale as much as body temperature. The men took turns tending this stove, watching the blue flame with attention that suggested more than practical interest. The fire represented warmth, civilization, survival itself, burning steadily against the cold. Darkness did not come. They had crashed during the Arctic summer, when the sun circled without setting, maintaining perpetual daylight that seemed unnatural to those accustomed to night's rhythm. Sleep would come in snatches, divorced from the clock's logic, whenever exhaustion overcame the strangeness of sleeping in endless light. Bayagai began preparing the radio for transmission. The work required patience, careful handling of components that had survived stress but might fail under further disturbance. He connected batteries, tested circuits, made adjustments with fingers numbed by cold. The generator, hand-cranked and demanding, would supplement battery power, though the effort it required was considerable for men already depleted. The first distress messages were composed. Coordinates, though uncertain given the navigation challenges of their final hours, were calculated as carefully as possible. The message itself was simple. Italia crashed. Position approximate. Survivors awaiting rescue. Bayagai began transmitting on frequencies that should reach Kings Bay or passing ships, his key tapping out the Morse code that carried their plea across the frozen air. No response came. The signals traveled outward into silence, absorbed by distance or atmospheric conditions or simple misfortune. The radio received nothing but static, the endless hiss that would become maddening over the days ahead. Yet Bayagai continued transmitting, because continuing was the only choice that offered hope. Night hours arrived in name only, marked by a slight dimming of the light that filtered through fog and tent fabric. The men arranged watches, someone always awake, always monitoring, always maintaining the human presence against the indifferent cold. They did not speak much during these early hours, each processing privately what had occurred and what lay ahead. The red tent glowed faintly when light struck its fabric, a small warmth of color in the white and gray world surrounding it. Inside, 10 men waited for an answer that had not yet come. They build what shelter they can from wreckage and will, a red bloom upon the white. Giuseppe Bayagai understood that the radio represented their only connection to rescue. The equipment, salvaged from the crash with improbable good fortune, consisted of a transmitter capable of reaching perhaps 1,000 miles under favorable conditions, a receiver for monitoring responses, and power sources that would require careful management. The fate of all 10 men might depend upon signals traveling through air they could not see to ears they could not know. The transmitter operated on shortwave frequencies, its antenna strung between improvised poles outside the tent. Bayagai had rigged this antenna with materials at hand, creating a system that functioned despite being far from ideal. The power came initially from batteries that had survived the crash, supplemented by a hand-cranked generator that demanded physical effort from men whose reserves were already diminished. Each transmission followed the same pattern. Bayagai would tap out their call sign, the Italia's identification, followed by position coordinates, followed by the essential message, crashed survivors awaiting help. He would repeat this sequence at scheduled intervals, then switch to receiving mode, listening through headphones for any response. The static that filled his ears offered no words, no acknowledgement, no indication that anyone had heard. The scheduled intervals were carefully chosen. Radio propagation in polar regions followed patterns influenced by the ionosphere, the upper atmosphere's electrical layers that could reflect signals across great distances, or absorb them entirely. Bayagai timed his transmissions to coincide with conditions most likely to favor propagation, drawing on his professional training and experience. Yet conditions remained stubbornly unfavorable. Days passed without response. The monotony of transmission, key clicking, static listening, silence confirming, wore upon Bayagai and upon those who watched him work. Hope required constant renewal in the face of constant disappointment. The men took turns operating the generator, providing the power that kept their fragile thread extended toward a world that seemed to have forgotten them. The tent's interior became defined by the radio's presence. Bayagai's station occupied one corner, the equipment arranged with care that spoke to its importance. The headphones, placed over his ears for hours each day, seemed to grow into an extension of his body. His expression while listening remained neutral, concealing the disappointment that each silent session renewed. Power conservation required difficult choices. The batteries held limited charge. The generator demanded energy from men who needed every calorie for warmth and survival. Bayagai calculated the minimum transmission power that might reach civilization, reducing output to extend their capacity. Yet reduced power meant reduced range, and range was everything in their situation. The other men watched these efforts with the attention of those whose lives depended upon outcomes they could not influence. They understood the radio's significance without understanding its technical details, knew that the clicking key carried messages they could not send by any other means. Some offered encouragement, others simply observed, their silence a form of support. Malmgren, the meteorologist, monitored conditions that affected radio propagation. He noted atmospheric disturbances that might interfere with signals, shared observations that helped Bayagai time his transmissions. This collaboration represented the broader pattern of their survival, each man contributing what he possessed, knowledge and effort pooled toward common purpose. The receiver picked up fragments occasionally, voices speaking languages that might have been Russian or Norwegian, music that seemed to come from another world, static patterns that almost resolved into meaning before dissolving back into noise. These fragments tortured more than they comforted, suggesting a populated world just beyond reach, civilization continuing while they remained stranded and unheard. Bayagai maintained his schedule despite the silence. Professionalism and discipline sustained him where hope might have faltered. The transmissions continued at appointed hours, the key clicking out coordinates that crept southward as their ice floe drifted, the message unchanging in its essential plea. We are here, we are alive, we are waiting. The other survivors developed routines that accommodated the radio's demands. They kept quiet during listening periods, moved carefully to avoid disturbing the equipment, took their turns at the generator without complaint. The radio had become the center of their small community, the focus around which all other activities arranged themselves. Each night, marked only by slight dimming of the endless daylight, Bayagai summarized the day's efforts in a log. No contact, he wrote repeatedly. Transmissions continue. Power reserves stable. These entries accumulated, a record of patience and persistence that would later document their ordeal for history. The static continued its meaningless hiss, filling headphones with sound that signified nothing. And yet the key continued clicking, sending words into the frozen air, waiting for an answer. Bayagai taps out their position again and again, sending words into a silence that does not answer. The ice floe carrying the red tent measured perhaps 100 meters across, a fragment of frozen ocean drifting upon currents that answered to no human intention. Each day, the survivors woke to find themselves in a different position, not visibly different, for the ice looked the same in all directions, but mathematically different, their coordinates shifting southward and eastward in patterns that navigation calculations revealed. Routines emerged from necessity. The men organized their days around essential tasks, melting ice for water, preparing and consuming rationed meals, tending to the injured, maintaining the radio schedule, keeping watch for weather changes or approaching rescue. These routines provided structure that sustained sanity as much as they sustained bodies. Food became the central concern after shelter and warmth. The supplies recovered from the crash would not last indefinitely. Rationing began immediately and grew stricter as days accumulated. Each man received portions measured with care: a small amount of pemmican, a few biscuits, a square of chocolate that might have to last an entire day. Hunger became a constant companion, a sensation that never fully departed regardless of what was eaten. Water came from the ice beneath their feet, chunks hacked from the surface and melted over the small stove. The process was slow, the yield modest but sufficient for survival. The water tasted flat, mineral-free, neither satisfying nor unpleasant, simply the liquid medium that kept their bodies functioning. The injured required continuous attention. Nobile's fractures had been stabilized but caused him constant pain, which he bore with the quiet stubbornness of one determined not to burden others more than necessary. Sessiony's leg demanded similar stoicism. He could not leave the tent without assistance, yet maintained his spirits through conversation and participation in what planning was possible. The medical supplies salvaged from the crash: bandages, disinfectants, a small quantity of medications, had to be used sparingly. Malmgren continued his meteorological observations, recording conditions that might affect their situation: wind directions, temperatures, cloud formations. He noted them all in a log that maintained scientific discipline despite circumstances that could not be less conducive to research. This work served practical purposes as well. Understanding weather helped them prepare for changes in conditions that might threaten their fragile shelter. The tent itself required maintenance. Wind worked at its seams, threatening to open gaps that would admit cold drafts. The fabric needed occasional adjustment, its poles repositioned when ice beneath shifted. The men took turns inspecting and repairing, treating their shelter with the care that its importance warranted. Watch schedules ensured someone was always awake, scanning the horizon for aircraft or ships, monitoring conditions, maintaining the small fire that provided heat. These watches were lonely hours, spent in contemplation that could drift toward despair if not carefully managed. The watchers developed strategies, counting objects, reciting remembered poems, calculating navigation problems, to keep their minds occupied. Days blurred together. The perpetual daylight made time fluid, marked only by meal times and radio schedules rather than by the natural rhythm of sun and darkness. The men slept when fatigue demanded, woke when rest had been sufficient, oriented themselves by tasks rather than hours. Conversations helped pass the time. The men spoke of home, of families waiting without knowledge of their survival, of meals they missed and streets they remembered. They debated questions of history and science, told stories from their earlier lives, shared observations about their current circumstances. Speech connected them to their former selves, reminding them of identities that extended beyond their present role as castaways. The ice beneath them moved continuously, its drift carrying them across polar waters toward destinations they could not choose. Navigation calculations, performed when conditions allowed sun observations, tracked their progress or regression, depending on perspective. They were moving, but whether toward rescue or further into isolation remained unknown. Morale fluctuated with circumstances. Days when the radio seemed to receive near-comprehensible signals brought hope. Days of unbroken static lowered spirits. Good weather lifted moods. Fog and wind depressed them. The men learned to support one another through these fluctuations, offering encouragement when needed, accepting it when their turn came. The red tent glowed when light struck it directly, a small beacon upon the endless white. Inside, 10 men maintained their patient vigil, waiting for the world to notice them, working to survive until notice came. The ice moves beneath them imperceptibly, carrying their small camp across polar waters. As days accumulated without rescue, debate arose among the survivors about alternative strategies. The ice floe drifted, but it drifted slowly. The distance to land, while great, was not infinite. Some among the men began calculating whether walking might offer a path to safety that waiting could not provide. Mariano, the engineer, was among the first to advocate for a walking party. He argued that able-bodied men, traveling light across the ice, might reach Svalbard or alert passing ships more quickly than the slow drift of their flow permitted. The distance was formidable, perhaps 200 miles to the nearest land, but not impossible for determined men moving steadily. Zappi, the navigator, supported this view. He possessed skills essential for ice travel, the ability to read terrain, to navigate without landmarks, to judge the safety of ice surfaces. His confidence in the feasibility of walking grew as he studied the conditions visible from their flow. The ice appeared solid, the leads of open water manageable, the direction clear. Malmgren presented the opposite perspective. The Swedish meteorologist understood ice conditions better than anyone else present. He had spent years studying polar environments. He warned of dangers invisible to those without his experience. Thin ice, sudden storms, the exhaustion that accumulated over days of struggle. Yet even Malmgren eventually conceded that the walking party had potential merit, provided the right precautions were taken. The debate continued over several days, interrupted by routines and radio schedules, but never far from anyone's thoughts. Those who could not walk, Nobile, Sessioni, listened with the complicated emotions of men who must trust their fate to others' decisions. Those who might walk weighed personal danger against the possibility of hastening rescue for all. The decision came slowly, formed through collective deliberation rather than command. 3 men would walk, Mariano, Zappi, and Malmgren. They would travel light, carrying minimal supplies, moving as quickly as ice conditions permitted. Their goal was Svalbard's northern coast, where they might find settlements or signal-passing vessels. Preparations were simple but careful. Food was allocated from the common stock, enough to sustain 3 men for perhaps 2 weeks, calculated on the assumption that they would reach land within that time. Navigation instruments were distributed, along with essential equipment for ice travel. Warm clothing, already in short supply, was arranged to give the walkers the best protection available. The morning of departure arrived without ceremony. The 3 men who would walk gathered their packs, checked their equipment one final time, exchanged farewells with those who would remain. Words were few, meanings were deep. Each understood that this parting might be final, that the ice held uncertainties that planning could not eliminate. Mariano spoke briefly, expressing confidence in their mission's success. Zappi outlined their intended route, promising to send help the moment they reached civilization. Malmgren, ever the scientist, noted the conditions and their implications for the journey ahead. His face bore an expression that combined determination with something harder to name, perhaps premonition, perhaps simply the weight of what he understood about polar ice. They walked away from the red tent into the white expanse, their figures growing smaller with each step. Those who remained watched in silence, tracking the three shapes as they navigated pressure ridges and crossed flat expanses. The fog, mercifully, had lifted enough to permit this watching, a small kindness from conditions that had offered so few. The walking party maintained formation, moving steadily toward the horizon. Malmgren's slight limp, an old injury aggravated by the crash, was visible even at distance. Yet he moved with the others, matching their pace, committed to the course they had chosen. Eventually, the three figures became specks, difficult to distinguish from the shadows of ice formations. Then they were gone, swallowed by distance and the endless similarity of the frozen surface. The remaining survivors turned back to their routines, their tent, their radio. 7 men now waited where 10 had survived the crash. The mathematics of their situation continued to shift, though its ultimate resolution remained hidden in days not yet lived. 3 silhouettes moved toward the horizon, growing smaller, until the ice swallows them from sight. June 6th arrived 12 days after the crash, a date that would transform the survivors' situation from isolation to acknowledged existence. The change came not from their own efforts alone, but from an intersection of persistence and chance that defines so many pivotal moments. In a small village in northern Russia, Voznesenye, a settlement so remote that its name barely appeared on maps, a young amateur radio operator named Nikolai Schmidt sat at his homemade receiver. Schmidt was 22 years old, a peasant farmer whose fascination with radio had led him to construct equipment from salvaged parts and studied diagrams. His station was crude by professional standards, but his ears were trained and his attention was patient. That evening, Schmidt was scanning frequencies for distant signals, a hobby that polar geography made particularly rewarding during summer months when propagation conditions favored long-range reception. Through the static that filled his headphones, he caught fragments of something coherent, dots and dashes that resolved into recognizable Morse code. The call sign was familiar from newspaper reports. Italia. The message was unmistakable. Survivors, coordinates, awaiting rescue. Schmidt listened carefully, transcribing what he heard. When the transmission repeated, confirming his transcription, he understood the significance of what he had received. The Italia expedition, reported missing for nearly 2 weeks, had survivors. Their position was known. Help could be directed. The young operator moved quickly. He contacted Soviet authorities, who initially received his report with skepticism. Amateur operators sometimes imagined things, and the Italia's fate had been presumed sealed. But Schmidt persisted, providing details that could not have been fabricated, coordinates that placed survivors in a specific location upon the ice. The authorities began to take notice. Within hours, confirmation efforts were underway. Professional radio stations were alerted, directed to listen for transmissions on the frequencies Schmidt had identified. Other operators reported hearing similar signals, fragmentary but consistent. The pattern of evidence built toward an undeniable conclusion. The Italia survivors were alive and transmitting. At the red tent, Bayagai continued his routine without knowing that his signals had finally been heard. He tapped out coordinates, repeated the distress message, listened to static that seemed unchanged from previous days. The breakthrough had occurred on the receiving end, beyond his awareness, transforming his endless repetitions from futile gestures into successful communication. The news spread rapidly through official channels. The Soviet government announced the reception of signals. Italian authorities, alerted to the development, began coordinating response. Norwegian stations confirmed the transmissions. Within a day, the world knew that survivors of the Italia crash were alive on the ice, waiting for rescue. In Rome, in Oslo, in Moscow, plans began forming. Ships and aircraft would be mobilized. Routes would be calculated. The vast international rescue effort that would follow had its seeds in this moment. A young Russian farmer listening through headphones, catching words that others had missed. At the tent, the change manifested first as response on the receiver. Bayagai, listening during his scheduled periods, heard something other than static, voices acknowledging his transmissions, confirming his position, promising assistance. The words were faint, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference, but unmistakably directed at them. The effect on the survivors was immediate and profound. Men who had maintained hope through discipline alone now had concrete confirmation that the world knew they existed. Faces that had grown blank with the monotony of waiting showed animation. Words came more freely. Spirits lifted. The isolation that had pressed upon them retreated, replaced by the knowledge that somewhere people were moving toward their rescue. Bayagai reported the breakthrough to Nobile, who received the news with the stillness of one absorbing information that changes everything. The commander asked for details. What exactly had been heard from whom? What response had been promised? The details were fragmentary, but the essential message was clear. Their signals had reached civilization, and civilization was responding. The red tent seemed different that evening, though nothing physical had changed. The same canvas walls, the same ice beneath, the same endless daylight filtering through. Yet the men who occupied this space knew now that they were not forgotten, that their position on the drifting ice was marked on maps in distant cities, that eyes were turning toward them across hundreds of miles. The waiting continued, but its character had transformed. No longer the waiting of abandonment, now the waiting of anticipated rescue. After 12 days of silence, a voice from across the ice confirms they are not alone. The confirmation of survivors triggered one of the most extensive rescue operations in polar history. Nations that had been rivals in exploration became partners in salvation. Ships adjusted their courses. Aircraft were prepared and fueled. Crews volunteered for missions that carried obvious dangers. The Arctic, which had swallowed expeditions before, would not claim this one without a fight. The Soviet Union responded first and most substantially. The icebreaker Krasen, one of the most powerful ships of its type in the world, received orders to proceed toward the Italia survivor's position. Her captain, Carl Egge, understood both the capabilities of his vessel and the challenges that lay ahead. The distance was vast, the ice conditions were uncertain, the summer window for Arctic operations was limited, but the Krasen was designed for exactly such missions, and her crew knew their work. Norway, closest geographically to the crash site, mobilized vessels and aircraft. The sealing ship Hobby was already in Arctic waters and diverted toward the reported coordinates. Aircraft were prepared at bases in Svalbard, ready to launch as soon as weather permitted. Norwegian pilots, experienced in polar conditions, studied maps and calculated fuel requirements. Sweden contributed aircraft and pilots, including Einar Lundborg, whose name would become central to the rescue's unfolding story. Italian vessels sailed northward, carrying supplies and hope from the survivors' home country. The international nature of the response reflected the expedition's significance and the universal recognition that human life warranted extraordinary effort. Among those who volunteered was Roald Amundsen, the legendary Norwegian explorer whose relationship with Nobile had been marked by public dispute. Whatever personal grievances existed, Amundsen set them aside. He arranged passage aboard a French seaplane, the Latham 47, determined to participate in saving men who had been his rivals. This decision, noble in its intent, would lead to tragedy, though that outcome remained hidden in the days ahead. At the Red Tent, the survivors received fragmentary news of these mobilizations. Radio messages, still difficult to receive clearly, conveyed enough information to understand that multiple nations were mounting rescue efforts. The scale of response was larger than they had dared hope, a reflection of both their expedition's prominence and the international networks that polar exploration had created. The challenges facing the rescuers were substantial. The Italia's crash site lay hundreds of miles from the nearest ports, accessible only through ice-choked waters that could trap or crush ships. Aircraft faced similar difficulties: limited range, uncertain landing surfaces, whether that could change from flyable to fatal within hours. Every vessel and aircraft that departed carried crews who understood these risks. Coordination between rescue efforts required communication across distances and between nations with different languages and procedures. Radio networks that normally served commercial or military purposes were redirected toward the common goal. Meteorologists shared weather observations. Navigators pooled their knowledge of ice conditions. Supplies were allocated based on mission requirements rather than national preferences. The ice itself presented the central obstacle. Summer had begun, bringing slightly warmer temperatures that made the pack ice unstable in some areas while remaining solid in others. Leads of open water appeared and closed unpredictably. Pressure ridges, formed by the grinding of flows against one another, created barriers that ships had to force through with heavy cost in time and fuel. The survivors waited for these efforts to reach them, watching the horizon for aircraft, listening for the sounds of ships' engines that might penetrate the Arctic silence. Each day brought the possibility of sighting, the appearance of a speck in the sky, the distant shape of a vessel on the horizon. Each day, thus far, brought only continued waiting. The red tent remained their refuge, its fabric walls their boundary against the cold. Inside, the men maintained routines that now carried the additional weight of anticipation. Bayagai continued his radio work, now receiving as much as transmitting. The injured waited with the patience that their conditions demanded, and all of them listened for the sound that would mean rescue had arrived. From ports across the north, ships and aircraft turned toward the same frozen coordinates. Roald Amundsen had spent his life in polar regions. He had been the first to navigate the Northwest Passage, the first to reach the South Pole, the first to fly across the Arctic by airship aboard the Norge, that earlier expedition where Nobile had served as pilot and from which disputes over credit had arisen. Now, at 55 years of age, the great explorer prepared for one final Arctic journey. The tensions between Amundsen and Nobile had played out in public, through newspapers and books, through accusations and counter-accusations about who deserved recognition for the Norge's achievements. Yet when word arrived that Nobile and his crew were stranded on the ice, Amundsen set aside all grievance. He volunteered immediately, seeking any available aircraft that might carry him toward the rescue effort. The French government offered a Latham 47, a flying boat designed for ocean crossings. The aircraft was capable but aging, its design better suited to temperate waters than Arctic conditions. Amundsen accepted without hesitation. He assembled a small crew, French aviators familiar with the aircraft, and prepared for departure from Tromsø, Norway. On June 18th, the Latham 47 lifted from the waters near Tromsø and turned northward toward the Barents Sea. Amundsen had filed a flight plan indicating his intention to search for the Italia survivors, though the precise route remained flexible depending on conditions encountered. The aircraft carried fuel sufficient for extended flight, supplies for potential landing, and the hopes of those who understood what Amundsen's participation signified. The weather that day was acceptable but not ideal. Fog banks lay across portions of the intended route, and wind conditions remained uncertain. Experienced Arctic hands noted these factors with concern, knowing how quickly polar weather could overwhelm aircraft of that era. Yet the Latham 47 departed on schedule, its engines carrying Amundsen toward a rendezvous that would never occur. 3 hours after departure, radio contact with the Latham ceased. The aircraft had been transmitting position reports at intervals. Suddenly, the reports stopped. Attempts to re-establish communication failed. The silence that followed was absolute and permanent. Search efforts began immediately but found nothing. Ships and aircraft scoured the Barents Sea along the Latham's intended route. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, fragments of the aircraft were recovered. A wingtip float, a fuel tank, washing ashore on the Norwegian coast. These remnants told a story of disaster but provided no details of what had occurred. Amundsen and his crew were never found. The Barents Sea, cold and deep, had claimed them without explanation. The greatest polar explorer of his age had vanished while attempting to rescue a man who had been his rival, transforming personal dispute into a final act of selflessness. The news of Amundsen's disappearance reached the red tent through radio messages that Byagai received with difficulty. The survivors understood the significance. A legend of exploration had been lost while searching for them. The weight of this knowledge added complexity to their already burdened spirits. They had not asked for Amundsen's sacrifice. They could not undo it. They could only continue their own survival while honoring what he had attempted. At memorial services held later, Amundsen was celebrated as a hero who had died in the service of others. His willingness to set aside personal grievance in favor of human solidarity became the defining element of his final chapter. The Arctic, which he had known better than almost anyone, had taken him at last, but it had taken him in an act of rescue rather than conquest. The ice continued drifting. The survivors continued waiting. And somewhere beneath the cold waters of the Barents Sea, Roald Amundsen rested in the realm he had spent his life exploring. The great explorer vanishes into fog, and the Arctic claims one who knew her best. The weeks accumulated with a slowness that seemed to stretch time itself. Inside the red tent, 7 men maintained their vigil through conditions that tested every resource: physical, emotional, psychological. The days blurred together, distinguished only by meals and radio schedules, by subtle shifts in weather, by the gradual drift of their ice flow across polar waters. Food had become the central preoccupation. The supplies salvaged from the crash, already insufficient, dwindled steadily despite careful rationing. Each meal was measured with precision: a small portion of pemmican, a few biscuits, a square of chocolate that seemed to shrink with each distribution. Hunger gnawed constantly, a companion that never departed, that colored every thought and conversation. The men learned to prepare their rations in ways that maximized satisfaction. Pemmican could be heated into a thin broth that provided warmth along with calories. Biscuits could be softened in water, making them seem more substantial. Chocolate, the most precious item, was often saved for moments when morale needed particular support, a small luxury in circumstances that offered so few. Water came more easily than food. The ice beneath and around them provided unlimited raw material, requiring only the fuel to melt it. The small stove, tended carefully to conserve its limited fuel supply, produced enough water for drinking and for preparing what food they had. The taste was flat, lacking minerals, but it sustained life. The injured continued to require care. Nobile's fractures had stabilized but caused him persistent pain that he bore with quiet determination. Sessiony's leg, though healing slowly, prevented him from leaving the tent without assistance. The others took turns providing support, helping with movements, changing bandages, offering the small comforts that were possible in their circumstances. Conversations filled the hours that tasks could not occupy. The men spoke of home, families in Italy and Czechoslovakia, streets they had walked, meals they had enjoyed. They recalled earlier expeditions, debated scientific questions, told stories from their lives before the Italia. These conversations served purposes beyond entertainment. They maintained connections to identity, to the selves that existed beyond their current role as castaways. Dr. František Běhounek, the Czech physicist who had joined the expedition to study cosmic radiation, maintained his scientific observations despite everything. He recorded atmospheric conditions, noted the behavior of instruments that had survived the crash, continued the intellectual work that had brought him to the Arctic. This dedication to research provided him with purpose and offered the others an example of discipline maintained under pressure. The tent's interior had developed its own geography. Each man occupied a defined space, arranged to accommodate injuries and to maximize shared warmth. Movement required negotiation, the careful stepping over and around bodies, the polite adjustments that close quarters demanded. Privacy existed only internally, in thoughts that need not be spoken. The ice beneath them continued its imperceptible drift. Navigation calculations, performed when conditions permitted sun observations, tracked their southward movement. They had traveled perhaps 50 miles since the crash, carried by currents toward latitudes where rescue might become more feasible. Yet the drift also moved them away from the walking party's intended route, complicating efforts to coordinate. Weather varied unpredictably. Some days brought fog that enclosed the tent in gray isolation, reducing the world to the small space they occupied. Other days offered clarity, the horizon stretching in every direction, the ice brilliant under perpetual sunlight. Wind could rise without warning, testing the tent's fabric, requiring emergency reinforcement of poles and anchors. The red tent glowed when sunlight struck it directly, its color warm against the surrounding white. This warmth was visual rather than physical. The interior remained cold despite the fabric's appearance, but it offered psychological comfort. The men had created something human in an inhuman environment, a small assertion of presence against the vast indifference of the Arctic. Morale required constant maintenance. Some days, spirits rose on fragmentary radio messages suggesting rescue efforts continued. Other days, depression settled like the fog, making every task harder, every hour longer. The men supported one another through these fluctuations, offering encouragement when needed, accepting it when their turn came. The nights, marked only by slight dimming of light rather than darkness, brought their own challenges. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by cold, by the ice's groaning sounds, by the awareness of their situation that quiet hours amplified. Yet sleep was necessary, and the body's demands eventually overcame the mind's resistance. Days became weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. The survivors maintained their routines, their hope, their patient endurance. They had become experts in waiting, a skill none had sought to acquire, all had been forced to master. Beneath red fabric, days blend into weeks, measured by meals and the slow arc of the sun. June 20th brought transformation. The morning arrived like countless others, gray light filtering through tent fabric, cold air pressing against every surface, the routine of waking and assessing conditions. But this morning would end differently, marked by an event the survivors had imagined so often that its actual occurrence seemed almost unreal. Lieutenant Einar Lundborg of the Swedish Air Force had been flying search patterns across the ice for days. His aircraft, a Fokker fitted with skis for ice landing, carried him across expanses of white that looked identical from altitude. searching for the small mark of color that would indicate the survivors' camp. The coordinates from radio transmissions guided his general direction, but finding a tent on the vast Arctic ice required patience and luck. At mid-morning, Lundborg spotted it, a red shape against the white, unmistakable in its human origin. He circled, confirming the sighting, observing figures emerging from the tent below. The survivors were waving, their arms describing arcs of desperate welcome. Lundborg dipped his wings in acknowledgement, signaling that he had seen them, that rescue had arrived. The men on the ice watched the aircraft circle with emotions that exceeded their capacity for expression. Some wept, others stood motionless, unable to process what they were seeing. The aircraft, so ordinary an object in their former lives, seemed miraculous now, a messenger from a world they had feared might have forgotten them. For nearly 4 weeks they had waited for this moment. Now that it arrived, the weight of waiting made the joy almost unbearable. Lundborg descended, studying the ice surface for landing possibilities. The terrain was uneven. Pressure ridges and open leads complicated what might otherwise be a straightforward approach. Yet the Swedish pilot possessed skill and nerve. He selected a relatively flat area, aligned his aircraft, and brought it down in a controlled landing that scattered ice crystals in the prop wash. The survivors who could walk made their way toward the landed aircraft. Lundborg emerged, a young man in flight gear, stepping onto ice that had held these castaways for so many days. The first handshake, human contact from the outside world, carried significance that simple description cannot capture. Words were exchanged, greetings and thanks and practical assessments of the situation. Lundborg brought supplies, food, medical equipment, news from the rescue coordination. He surveyed the survivors, noting injuries and conditions, calculating what his aircraft could accomplish. The Fokker had limited capacity. Evacuation would require multiple flights. The question was immediate: who would go first? The pilot recommended beginning with the most seriously injured, a decision that seemed logical from a rescue perspective. Sessiony's broken leg made him an obvious candidate, as did Nobile's fractures. Yet the aircraft could carry only one passenger per flight, and the ice conditions made each landing risky. Time and weather pressed upon every decision. For the survivors, Lundborg's arrival transformed their situation from endurance to anticipation. They knew now that rescue was not merely possible but active, that aircraft and ships were working toward their extraction. The isolation that had defined their experience gave way to connection, to Lundborg standing among them, to the radio messages that now flowed more freely, to the supplies that supplemented their depleted stocks. Yet dangers remained. The ice continued drifting, weather could close in without warning. Each flight carried risks for pilot and passenger alike. The rescue was underway, but it was not complete. The survivors understood this, tempering their relief with awareness that safety had not yet been achieved. Lundborg prepared for his first evacuation flight, the beginning of an extraction that would prove more complicated than anyone anticipated. A small aircraft circles overhead, and the men wave upward at their first visitor in weeks. The decision about who would leave first became the most debated moment of the entire Italia saga. Lundborg had recommended evacuating the injured, and among the injured, Nobile was the most senior, the commander, the one whose survival might be considered most symbolically important. Yet the commander's departure before his men raised questions that would follow Nobile for the remainder of his life. Arguments have been offered from multiple perspectives. Some maintain that Lundborg insisted on taking Nobile, believing the commander's injuries and leadership position warranted priority. Others suggest that Nobile himself should have refused, should have demanded that his men, Sessiony, whose leg injury was equally severe, depart before him. The truth likely contains elements of both: urgency, impaired judgment, the confusion of a rescue underway in difficult conditions. Nobile was helped to the aircraft, his injured leg making movement difficult. He looked back at the men who remained, at the red tent that had sheltered them, at faces that watched his departure with emotions too complex for simple reading. Then the aircraft lifted, carrying Italy's polar commander away from the ice where his expedition had met disaster. Lundborg delivered Nobile to the rescue coordination base, then turned around for another flight. The plan was to continue evacuations, to remove the remaining survivors one by one until all had been extracted. But the ice, which had cooperated for the first landing, proved less forgiving on the second attempt. During his return flight, Lundborg encountered deteriorating conditions. Fog had moved in. The landing area near the tent was less visible than before. His approach was complicated by wind shifts and reduced visibility. The aircraft touched down, but the landing was rough, too rough. A strut collapsed, the plane slewed across the ice, and Lundborg found himself stranded with the very men he had come to rescue. The irony was bitter. The rescuer had become another survivor, adding one more person to the group awaiting extraction. The aircraft that had represented salvation now sat disabled on the ice, its broken strut beyond repair with available materials. Lundborg would remain with the tent party, sharing their situation, waiting for the next rescue attempt. For the men who had watched Nobile depart, the sequence of events raised questions that intensified over subsequent days. Their commander was safe. They remained stranded. The rescue that had seemed imminent had suffered a setback. Some felt abandonment. Others maintained loyalty to Nobile's decisions. All experienced the frustration of hopes raised and then complicated. Nobile, from his position at the rescue base, attempted to coordinate further efforts. His injuries limited his mobility, but his knowledge of the situation and his authority as commander gave him a role in planning. Yet criticism had already begun, whispered at first, then louder, questioning why the leader had left before his men. This criticism would grow into formal inquiry after the survivors returned to Italy. The red tent now sheltered 8 men, the original 7 survivors plus Lundborg. Space was tighter. Supplies were stretched further. The social dynamics shifted with the addition of an outsider who understood their predicament in new and personal ways. Lundborg shared what he knew of rescue efforts, of ships approaching, of other aircraft preparing, of the international attention their situation had drawn. Days passed. The disabled aircraft sat on the ice near the tent, a reminder of rescue's fragility. The survivors maintained their routines, now with additional hope that the world's attention would bring eventual extraction. They waited, as they had learned to wait, with patience born of necessity. The leader departs first, leaving questions that will outlast the ice itself. The Krasen represented the most powerful rescue asset moving toward the Italia survivors. Built in Britain but operated by the Soviet Union, she was an icebreaker of exceptional capability, designed to force passage through frozen waters that would trap or crush lesser vessels. Her bow, reinforced and sharply angled, could ride up onto ice and break it by sheer weight. Her engines, massive for the era, provided the power necessary to make progress through conditions that would halt other ships. Captain Carl Egge commanded the Krasen with the calm authority of one who understood both his vessel's capabilities and the ice's challenges. He had navigated Arctic waters for years, learning the patience that polar regions demanded. Progress was measured not in nautical miles but in meters, each advance hard-won, each retreat accepted as temporary setback rather than defeat. The journey from the Soviet Union toward the Italia's position covered vast distances through ice-choked waters. The Krasen departed from Leningrad, rounded Scandinavia, entered the Barents Sea, and pushed northward toward coordinates that radio messages had established. The route took weeks, each day bringing new obstacles that required navigation skill and mechanical endurance. The pack ice varied in thickness and density. Some areas permitted steady progress, the Krasen crushing through relatively thin ice with sounds of grinding and cracking that filled the air. Other areas presented thicker obstacles, requiring repeated charges, the ship backing away, then surging forward at full power, climbing onto the ice edge and breaking it with her weight. These charges exhausted crew and machinery alike. Open leads appeared occasionally, dark channels of water that allowed faster progress until they closed or ended. The navigators studied ice conditions constantly, seeking routes that balanced speed against safety. Steam rose from the ship's stacks in continuous columns, visible for miles across the flat ice surface, marking the Krasen's position for anyone watching. The ship carried an aircraft, a small reconnaissance plane that could launch from the deck and scout conditions ahead. This aircraft proved invaluable for route finding, its pilots identifying leads and thinner ice that the ship could exploit. The coordination between air and sea represented the rescue operation's sophisticated nature, multiple assets working in concert toward the common goal. The crew knew the stakes. Somewhere ahead, men waited on drifting ice, their survival depending on the Krasen's progress. This knowledge infused every watch, every charge against the ice, every calculation of route and speed. The work was exhausting, the noise constant, the vibrations wearing, the cold persistent despite the ship's heating, but purpose sustained effort. News from the rescue coordination reached the Krasen by radio. The crew learned of Nobile's evacuation, of Lundborg's stranding, of the conditions at the Red Tent. They understood that their approach represented the most reliable hope for the remaining survivors, that aircraft rescues had proven uncertain in the challenging ice environment. As the Krasen pushed northward, her progress became a story followed worldwide. Reports from the ship described conditions and advances, setbacks and renewed efforts. The vessel had become a symbol of the rescue operation's determination, proof that the international community would not abandon the Italia survivors to the ice. The days accumulated as the distance diminished. Each report placed the Krasin closer to the survivors' position, the gap narrowing slowly but steadily. The men at the red tent listened to radio updates with growing hope, imagining the great ship forcing her way toward them, her engines thundering against the frozen resistance. The ice continued breaking. The ship continued advancing. Rescue approached with the patience that Arctic operations demanded. The icebreaker forces passage through frozen waters, each meter hard-won against the pack. The walking party had departed weeks before, 3 men setting out across the ice toward distant land. Mariano, Zappi, and Malmgren had walked southward, navigating by compass and sun, crossing pressure ridges and skirting open leads in their journey toward Svalbard's coast. Their progress had been slow, their conditions increasingly difficult, their fate unknown to those who remained at the red tent. On July 12th, an aircraft from the Krasin spotted 2 figures on the ice. The pilot, scouting ahead of the ship's route, circled to confirm what he was seeing: 2 men, waving, clearly alive but clearly in distress. The aircraft carried no capacity for landing on the rough ice. The pilot could only note the position and return to the ship with his report. 2 figures. 3 men had departed the walking party. The mathematics was immediate and grim. The Krasin adjusted course toward the siding, her crew working with renewed urgency. When the ship reached the location, boats were lowered and the 2 survivors were brought aboard. Zappi and Mariano, weakened by their ordeal, required immediate medical attention. They had been walking for weeks, their supplies exhausted, their bodies pushed to limits that nearly exceeded endurance. Malmgren was not with them. The Swedish meteorologist had perished during the journey, his body left behind on the ice under circumstances that would later become the subject of difficult questions. The survivors described his declining condition, his injuries from the crash exacerbated by the demands of ice travel, his decision at some point that he could go no further. The precise details remained with the ice, known only to those who had been present. The rescue of Zappi and Mariano brought relief mixed with sorrow. 2 men had been saved who might otherwise have been lost. 1 man had perished who might otherwise have survived. The walking party's journey had ended in partial success and partial tragedy, its story becoming one of the expedition's most complex chapters. Aboard the Krasin, the rescued men received care that their weeks on ice had made desperately needed. Warm food, medical treatment, rest, the basic elements of recovery that had been unavailable during their march. They told their story to those who would listen, describing conditions that challenged imagination, hardships that exceeded preparation. The news reached the red tent by radio, bringing the survivors there a mixture of emotions. Relief that Zappi and Mariano had been found, grief for Malmgren's loss, awareness that the ice claimed its costs regardless of courage or determination. The walking party's fate reminded everyone of the margins on which their own survival balanced. The Krasin continued toward the red tent, now carrying additional urgency. The remaining survivors, Viglieri, Bayagai, Trojani, Behaunek, Sessiony, and Lundborg waited for the ship that would bring their ordeal to an end. The ice continued breaking before the great vessel's bow, the distance shrinking hour by hour. 2 figures remain where 3 departed, and the ice holds its silence about what passed. July 12th continued with events that would conclude the survivors' ordeal. The Krassin, having rescued Zappi and Mariano, resumed her course toward the red tent's position. The coordinates had been updated continuously as the ice floe drifted, the target moving even as the ship approached. Yet the gap diminished steadily, each hour bringing the rescue closer to completion. At the tent, the remaining survivors watched the horizon with attention that weeks of waiting had refined into expertise. They knew the Krassin was approaching. Radio messages had confirmed her progress. The question was when the ship would appear, when the waiting would finally end, when they could leave the ice that had held them for nearly 7 weeks. The first sighting came in the afternoon. A dark shape appeared on the horizon, initially uncertain, gradually resolving into the unmistakable form of a ship. The survivors pointed, exclaimed, embraced one another with the unrestrained emotion that the moment permitted. The Krassin was visible. Rescue had arrived. The ship grew larger as she approached, her hull forcing passage through ice that had seemed impenetrable. The sounds of her work reached the survivors, the grinding, the cracking, the deep vibration of engines at work. These sounds, so different from the silence that had surrounded them, seemed to belong to another world entirely. The Krassin halted at a distance that ice conditions made necessary. Boats were lowered, manned by crew members who would cross the intervening ice to reach the survivors. The process took time. Ice had to be navigated, gaps crossed, obstacles circumvented, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The rescuers were coming. The meeting was emotional beyond description. Soviet sailors reached the red tent, healthy and capable men encountering the worn survivors who had endured so much. Hands were clasped. Words were exchanged in languages that barriers could not prevent from communicating. The universality of the moment transcended nationality. These were humans helping humans, the simplest and most profound of connections. The evacuation proceeded with careful attention to the injured. Sessiony, whose broken leg had prevented independent movement throughout the ordeal, was carried across the ice by sailors who understood the importance of their task. Behaunek, Viglieri, Bayagai, Trojani, and Lundborg followed, each making the journey from tent to ship that marked their transition from castaways to rescued. The red tent remained behind when the last man departed. The fabric that had sheltered them, the poles that had supported their survival, stood empty upon the drifting ice. Eventually the ice would carry this remnant away, would bury it in snow, or drop it into waters opened by summer warmth. But for now it remained, a small monument to human endurance, red against the endless white. Aboard the Krassin, the survivors experienced the shock of safety. Warmth enveloped them, provided by the ship's heating systems that seemed almost excessive after weeks in the cold. Food was offered, real meals, prepared in the ship's galley, unlimited by rationing. Medical attention was available, professional and thorough, addressing injuries and conditions that had been managed with improvised care. The transition from survival to recovery had begun. Yet even as bodies relaxed and minds released the tension of their ordeal, awareness persisted of those who would not share this moment. 9 men had vanished with the envelope, never to be found. Malmgren had perished during the walking party's journey. Amundsen had disappeared while searching for them. The rescue was triumph and tragedy intertwined, success achieved at costs that could not be erased. The Krasin turned southward, carrying the survivors toward civilization, toward questions that awaited, toward the remainder of their lives. The great ship appears at last, and the red tent becomes a memory upon the drifting white. We pause now to remember those who did not survive. When the Italia's gondola struck the ice and the envelope tore away, 9 men were carried upward into the fog. They vanished within moments, borne by the buoyancy of hydrogen into gray skis that offered no return. Their names deserve speaking, their presence in this story deserving of acknowledgement. Eder Arduino, Chief Engine Technician; Attilio Carati, Engine Mechanic; Renato Alessandrini, Engine Mechanic; Callisto Siaka, Rigger; Vincenzo Pomella, Rigger. These 5 men had worked in the engine nacelles and along the envelope structure, positions that placed them in or near the fabric when it separated. They were carried away with the machine they had tended. Pontremoli, the physicist; Lego, the journalist; Tomaselli, another journalist. These 3 had been positioned within the envelope structure or were caught as it rose. Their professional purposes, science and documentation, ended in the same frozen unknown. Ugo Lego had been aboard to record the expedition for Italian newspapers, his observations intended for audiences who would never read them. The journalist's presence reflected the expedition's prominence, the public attention that surrounded Italian polar ambition. The envelope, still holding hydrogen, likely continued drifting after the separation. How far it traveled, where it came down, what occurred to the men aboard, these questions found no answers. Search efforts later scanned the ice for any sign, any remnant that might reveal their fate. Nothing was ever found. The Arctic kept its secrets with the indifference it had always shown to human inquiry. The 9 are presumed to have perished, though the precise circumstances remain unknown. The cold would have been a factor. Injuries from the separation might have been another. The simple inability to survive without supplies or shelter would eventually have claimed any who remained alive after the initial event. Their families received no bodies to bury, no certainty to accompany grief. The ambiguity of loss without confirmation carries its own particular weight, hope impossible to sustain yet impossible entirely to extinguish. The ice became their memorial, unmarked and vast. In Italy, ceremonies honored the lost. Names were spoken in churches and public gatherings. The expedition that had sought national glory had produced national mourning, the costs of polar ambition made concrete in empty chairs at family tables. We remember them here not with detailed accounts. Detail is unavailable, but with the simple acknowledgement that they existed, that they ventured into danger for purposes they believed worthy, that their absence diminished the world that remained. The history of exploration is marked by such losses, names that fade from memory, unless deliberate effort preserves them. Eder Arduino, Attilio Carati, Renato Alessandrini, Callisto Siaka, Vincenzo Pamela, Pontrimali, Lego, Tomaselli, and one other whose name completes the 9. The ice holds them still, somewhere beneath its shifting surface, preserved by cold that acknowledges no distinction between the celebrated and the obscure. We pause to remember those who vanished with the torn envelope, carried into fog and silence. The survivors returned to a world that had followed their ordeal with intense attention. Newspapers had chronicled each development, from the crash's announcement through the rescue's completion. The Italia expedition had become an international story, its participants transformed from explorers into celebrities of a particular and complicated kind. The Krassin delivered her passengers to ports where crowds gathered to witness their arrival. The survivors disembarked into the flash of cameras and the calls of journalists, their weakened conditions visible to all who watched. They were thinner, their faces marked by weeks of deprivation, their movements careful with injuries not fully healed. For Nobile, the homecoming carried immediate complications. Questions about his evacuation before his men had already surfaced in the press, raised by those who saw in his departure a failure of leadership. The criticism intensified as the survivors returned, their accounts providing material for those inclined to find fault. Italy's polar hero faced transformation into a figure of controversy. A formal inquiry was convened, tasked with examining the expedition's decisions and outcomes. Nobile appeared before this tribunal, defending choices made under conditions that the examiners had not experienced. The questioning was detailed and sometimes hostile, focusing on navigation decisions, the extended survey, the crash itself, and the evacuation sequence. The inquiry's conclusions were harsh. Nobile was assigned significant responsibility for the expedition's failures, his reputation damaged by official findings that emphasized his mistakes while minimizing his achievements. He resigned his military commission, his career in Italian aviation effectively ended by the judgment of those who had remained safely on the ground. The other survivors faced less scrutiny but carried their own burdens. Physical recovery took months for some. Psychological recovery took longer. The trauma of their experience, the crash, the loss of companions, the weeks of uncertainty, manifested in ways that varied by individual. Some returned to normal lives with apparent ease. Others struggled with memories that would not release their grip. The political context colored everything. Italy under Mussolini's fascist government had promoted the expedition as a demonstration of national capability. The disaster complicated this narrative, requiring either acknowledgement of failure or assignment of blame. Nobile became the convenient target, his fall satisfying the need for accountability while protecting the broader project of Italian prestige. Years would pass before perspectives shifted. Subsequent analysis of the expedition found less fault with Nobile than the initial inquiry had assigned. The decisions criticized in 1928 appeared more reasonable when examined with fuller understanding of polar conditions. Nobile lived until 1978, long enough to see his reputation partially restored, though the controversy never entirely faded. The other survivors scattered to their various lives. Bayagai continued his career in radio, the skills he had demonstrated on the ice proving valuable in subsequent decades. Bihaunek returned to scientific work, his observations from the expedition contributing to cosmic ray research. Each carried the experience differently, some speaking of it frequently, others preferring silence. The Italia expedition became a chapter in polar history, studied for its lessons about Arctic navigation, rescue coordination, and human endurance. The names of those involved, Nobile, Amundsen, the 9 who vanished, those who survived, entered the record that documents humanity's engagement with Earth's extreme places. The survivors return to a world of questions, where judgment awaits alongside relief. Decades have passed since the Italia fell upon the ice. The world that launched that expedition, the world of airships and polar ambition, of national rivalries played out in frozen latitudes, has receded into history. Yet the story retains its power, speaking across years to anyone who contemplates human endurance in extreme circumstances. The Arctic itself continues, indifferent to the dramas enacted upon its surface. The ice drifts as it has always drifted, responding to currents and winds that care nothing for human presence. The coordinates where the Italia crashed have been crossed countless times since by ice that recognizes no memorial. Whatever remains of the wreckage, the red tent, the supplies left behind, all have long since been scattered, sunk, or buried beyond any recovery. The lessons of the expedition informed subsequent polar operations. Rescue coordination improved, informed by the challenges that the Italia response had revealed. Radio protocols developed, incorporating understanding gained from Bayagai's lonely transmissions. The international cooperation that had characterized the rescue effort suggested models for future emergencies, where national boundaries mattered less than human need. Nobile lived long enough to see assessments of his leadership become more balanced. In his later years, he wrote and spoke about the expedition, offering perspectives that the immediate aftermath had not permitted. He maintained that the decisions criticized at the time had been reasonable given available information, that the conditions faced could not have been anticipated or avoided. History has largely, though not universally, supported this view. The other participants aged and eventually passed, taking with them direct memories of days beneath the red tent. Their accounts, recorded in various forms, provide the basis for understanding what they experienced. Yet no account fully captures the reality of weeks on drifting ice, the particular quality of cold and waiting and uncertainty that defined their ordeal. The 9 who vanished with the envelope remain lost, their fate unknown despite decades of occasional speculation. The Arctic keeps its secrets permanently, yielding nothing to inquiries that come too late. Their families found what closure was possible in ceremonies and memories, in the acknowledgement that their loved ones had sought something difficult and had paid the ultimate cost. Roald Amundsen's disappearance added a dimension of tragedy that extended beyond the expedition itself. The great explorer's death while attempting rescue transformed personal rivalry into selfless sacrifice, providing a narrative of redemption that history has found compelling. His legacy includes this final act, the choice to help a former adversary regardless of past disputes. The red tent became a symbol, referenced in subsequent accounts of polar survival, invoked whenever human resilience against natural forces required illustration. Its color, practical choice for visibility, acquired additional meanings. Hope against white emptiness, human presence asserted against inhuman cold. The ice continues drifting, today as in 1928. The Arctic remains, challenging any who venture there with conditions that technology has modified but not eliminated. The Italia's story persists as a reminder that such places demand respect, that ambition must account for consequences, that survival sometimes depends on patience and cooperation rather than heroic individual action. Decades pass, and the ice continues its slow dance, indifferent to the stories it has witnessed. We have traveled together through this history, from Kings Bay to the ice and back again. The journey began with an airship rising into Arctic skies, carrying 16 men and their ambitions toward the North Pole. We reached that pole, circled above it, marked it with flags and transmitted news of triumph to the listening world. Then conditions changed. Ice accumulated, fog descended, the Italia fell from the sky onto the frozen ocean. 9 men vanished with the torn envelope, lost forever to the Arctic that had drawn them north. 10 survived the crash, injured and stranded, possessing only what wreckage provided. We watched them build the red tent, establish routines, maintain the radio that would eventually connect them to rescue. We followed 3 men who walked toward land, learning later that only 2 would survive the journey. We mourned with the world when Amundsen disappeared, a great explorer lost while searching for those who had been his rivals. The rescue came, Swedish pilots, Soviet icebreakers, international effort coordinated across vast distances. The survivors were brought to safety after 49 days upon the ice, their ordeal ended by the determination of those who would not abandon them. The aftermath brought controversy and inquiry, judgment, and eventual reassessment. The participants returned to lives marked by what they had experienced, carrying memories that would never entirely fade. This is what we have witnessed together, told slowly, meant for restful listening. The story holds lessons about preparation and chance, about leadership under pressure, about the margins that separate survival from loss. But perhaps most of all, it holds the simple truth of human endurance, the capacity to persist through conditions that should exceed our limits. We offer gratitude to you for listening, for accompanying us through these frozen latitudes and difficult hours. May the rest of your night or day, or whenever you encounter these words, carry the peace that the survivors eventually found. We have traveled from departure to rescue, through weeks of cold and patience upon the polar ice. The ice stretches onward as it always has, as it always will. The polar regions know nothing of the stories we tell about them. They simply exist, vast and patient, indifferent to human passage. We leave this history now, settling into the quiet that follows any completed journey. Let the ambient sounds carry you, soft wind across frozen surfaces, the distant creak of ice shifting upon Arctic waters. These are ancient sounds, unchanged since before humans first ventured to these latitudes. Now we rest as the ice rests, beneath skis that stretch without end.